This morning, our panelists will share their insights on key considerations for selecting a development partner, how to protect intellectual property ownership, and how to successfully build and manage a virtual development team. If it sounds like I'm reading this off of paper, it's because I'm reading it off of paper. Joining us today on the panel is Jim Reed, the Vice President of Business Development and Marketing at Minneapolis-based Minnetronics. He joined Minnetronics in 2014 and brings more than 20 years' experience in the medical device and healthcare industries. Jim has extensive experience developing and negotiating outsourced partnership agreements with companies ranging in size from startups to tier ones. This morning, Jim will be talking about conserving capital and reducing risk through the use of consultants, outside services, and partners. Up next is Ken Levitt, a partner and chair of Dorsey's Minneapolis Patent Group. Ken helps medical device and technology companies protect and manage their intellectual property assets. He also provides legal counsel to businesses on how to build successful strategies for their patent and trade secret portfolios. Ken's talk today will cover key considerations for protecting IP during product development with a partner. And our third panelist is Steve Schmidt, founder and CEO of Resolution Medical. Resolution Medical is a privately held business innovation solutions provider for the medical device industry. Prior to founding Resolution, Steve was an executive at Great Batch Medical. He has extensive experience in operations and manufacturing engineering management. Steve's presentation this morning is titled, Effectively Managing Development and Manufacturing Partners, A Vendor's Perspective. All right, without further ado, welcome Jim Reed.
So if someone went into your home workshop and looked at your collection of tools there and asked you, what's the best tool? It'd be kind of a nonsensical question, right? The answer back would be, well, what are you trying to accomplish? If you're turning a screw, screwdrivers are great. If you're trying to pound something or break something, hammers are kind of handy for that. But they're not very interchangeable, right? In my workshop at home, I probably have a half dozen different kinds of hammers. I've got 25 or 30 different kinds of screwdrivers. They're all useful in their own way, but they're not the same thing at all. There are probably 1,000 companies out there doing med device development, design, verification, validation, and manufacturing, all unique, all different in their own ways, but they're not at all the same thing. And a lot of companies, when they're looking for an outsourcing partner, tend to look for individual companies or fits, and they're trying to sift through sort of all the tools in the universe. And it's pretty bloody hard. We have people come to us sometimes who are considering working with us. We're sort of a full-service vendor. And they'll tell us, we're thinking about working with you, or there's a China-based manufacturer, or my brother-in-law, Larry, went to Votech and owns a soldering iron. We're kind of weighing all these options against each other. And they're pretty different animals. And it becomes clear to us when we meet those people is that they're not quite clear on their objectives and requirements, because that should drive everything else. For example, your objectives drive requirements, your requirements drive timelines and budget and deliverables and all that stuff. But they should also drive the kind of vendor capabilities that you need. So rather than trying to pick the exact vendor, you got to find the vendor type. What kind of hammer? What kind of screwdriver? For example, the kinds of companies, ignore the name of the building, but the kinds of companies that could build the boat on the left are pretty different from the kinds of companies that could build the boat on the right. And people get surprisingly confused by that. Fortunately, there's 1,000 vendors out there, but it's possible to organize the world and make life a lot simpler just by looking at the discrete categories or buckets of vendors first before you go try to pick one out. Once you know what bucket you want, you can dig through it and find the partner that fits you the best. But if you're looking at all 6 buckets, it's a pretty overwhelming universe out there. So I'm going to go through all 6 of them, the kind of the pros and cons. They're all good at certain things. Pliers are great. Hammers are great. Screwdrivers are great. Again, they're not terribly interchangeable. And no one can do all the things well that all these different buckets tend to tackle. So in no particular order, I'm just going to start diving in here. First of all, the first bucket where everybody starts pretty much are individual consultants, and they're fantastic. for the right objective, the right requirements. If you have a smart individual, they can make amazing progress quickly and inexpensively. You typically only pay them when they're working, because you're paying for actual value. They're decisive because they're not spending time in staff meetings debating things, because it's one person. Unless they're schizophrenic, they can decide things pretty efficiently. And it's kind of endless supply. So a really great, strong, smart consultant can make great progress. The limitations are kind of what you'd expect. It's one guy. He gets hit by a bus or wins the lottery mid-project. And that's an issue to think about. You have one perspective, all the eggs in one basket, and they're typically geared towards producing stuff quickly, but not very methodically. So a typical classic fit for consultants where everybody starts is quick and dirty early development, prototypes, proof of concept work. It's a fantastic fit and a great option. Bucket number 2, consulting groups. It's a lot of the same, but different. So a lot of the same strengths. Again, you pay when you're making progress. You typically have more technical depth because it's not one person, it's a bunch of people. You have better continuity, typically a little more process, and the cons are kind of the same thing, right? You typically not a lot of methodical documentation of deliverables, and they are more expensive because they actually have overhead. They're kind of a company that has to actually operate. So not the most scalable, but the classic fit is quick and dirty development plus a bit more. Again, a very useful tool in the toolbox. Third, similar but different. Again, design development companies. They typically can be more systematic than consultants. Typically are better at documentation, more structured processes, often very good technical depth. You get a lot of smart people who are specialized in some way. They typically can document your outputs, which is important in our industry, obviously. They're typically agnostic about where it gets manufactured, right? They don't care. The design goes somewhere else, it gets built. They don't worry about it. They're not going to try to steer you anywhere in particular. And they often, not always, but often have good integrated industrial design and user interface capabilities in the organization, which is helpful. The cons are they don't manufacture, so there's never really a feedback loop of what happens to the device down the road. Is it manufacturable or not? Is it reliable? How robust is it actually? So typically not very designed for manufacturing oriented. So problems can get designed in. They're often multi-industry, which has pros and cons, right? They're typically, if you do a lot of consumer products, they're typically very good at ID and user interface stuff. If they're kind of part-time med device people, they may not have quite the right mindset all the time. And probably the biggest thing is when you have a developing company and a manufacturing company, not the same, there are always problems during ramp up and scale up. If you ask the designer, whose fault is that? What are they going to say? You picked a bad manufacturer, right? The manufacturer is always going to say it's a design company. You'd be a pickle in the middle to some extent. But still, a great tool. Typical fit is development of simpler products where manufacturing readiness and regulatory preparedness aren't necessarily as critical. The fourth bucket here, component vendors who want to go upstream. So in our world, we do electromechanical, electronic devices. So for us, people who make PCB boards sometimes want to go upstream and do devices. And it can be a good fit. Maybe your industry, it's a pump-based thing, or an extrusion vendor wants to make catheters, whatever. But typically they're very good at what they're good at. That component is very important. If that component is virtually the whole device, they can be a great solution. They're typically low cost and they're good at that piece. The cons are typically they're good at that, they're not good at everything else, and development capability may be a little thin, and they may not be interested in long-term support because they're used to making those components. But for the right project, they can be a good fit. So really, typical classic fit is component-heavy products, that don't need tons and tons of support. The fifth and sixth buckets here, contract manufacturers. The name implies they're very manufacturing focused. They're typically very, very sophisticated manufacturers. They're great at supply chain. They often operate in low-cost environments. So you have a high labor content product that can be very, very important to what you're trying to do. So a great tool for the right job. The cons are they're typically not development driven. Development is a means to an end. So the businesses are built around having to drive volume. So if you provide volume, it's a fantastic fit. If you can't or don't or you're late, that's more difficult. CMs can't linger for years waiting for your volume to ramp up when you finish clinicals and regulatory. At some point, you have to get there and put volume through their factory for you to fit. If you can't, they have to let you go. It's not their fault. They're good people, but they can't have low volume products by definition. So typical fit, products where manufacturing really is the key driver. Very important tool in the toolbox. And the last bucket, integrated companies. So integrated design, development, verification, validation, and manufacturing companies. The pros are typically good feedback loops from manufacturing development, so you get good DFM, design for reliability. If there are issues around ramp, you don't have a vendor pointing at a different vendor because it's all one bunch and you've got one neck to grab, which is pretty important. Typically motivated by both development and manufacturing, they tend to have pretty complete, more OEM-like systems and QMS systems. And they can typically scale pretty well. The cons, like you'd expect, are they're not good at prototyping, proof of concept, early stage work. They're typically overly expensive for that kind of stuff, overkill, not needed. And so a typical fit really is a product that has to be driven to commercialization. So take requirements, prototypes, or clinical units, all the way to market. So you have an integrated solution, particularly as an extension of your company. So there's lots of other factors, right? I was joking, ISO 1345 plus FDA site reg plus $3 gets you a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts here in Boston. There's lots of other factors to take into account. The hard costs, how capable and deep is your team? Can you manage a less capable outside vendor? If you have a lot of depth, you can do that. If you're 3 people and you're virtual, you probably need a little more of a self-sustaining, autonomous partner to carry the load for you. Can they do continuation engineering and obsolescence work over time as you do Gen 2, Gen 3, and on and on and on? Are they financially stable? Are they going to be around in 5 years when you get to market? Are they the right size and scale? It's no fun being their biggest customer if you've outgrown your vendor, and it's never any fun being your vendor's tiniest customer. That's never a fun spot to be. And lastly, you're going to be married to these people typically for years and years and years. So if you don't like them when you start, you're going to really not like them 5 years down the road. So making sure that they're the right sophistication level for you and they fit you, it's critically important. You go to the grocery store today, there's 1,000 different varieties of lettuce. It's crazy. But trying to weed through all the choices is simpler if you really remember the fundamentals here. It's important to be aware of your objectives and your requirements. That'll help you pick the right bucket. Once you pick the right bucket, it's way easier to dig through that bucket and find the right partner than trying to look through the entire universe. And once you have your goals really clear in mind, the choice of bucket is going to become typically pretty clear. If someone tells you they can do anything, they're good at everything, they're either lying to you, they're delusional, or they're lying to you delusionally. Those are the 3 options as far as I can tell. So we're not good at everything, nobody else is, and it's a good first question to ask. They say we're fantastic at every single thing. You should know that. So we're not fit for everybody. Nobody is. So we'd be happy to give you advice for people in other buckets if that's helpful. And remember, bear your buckets in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Audience questions? We'll open up the floor for a few minutes in case anybody has questions for Jim. Hearing none. Jim, one question. What's the biggest sort of mistake that vendors make in their selection process? No, that should be on.
It is. I think there are 2. One is sticking with a consultant or tiny vendor for too long. We've had people show up in the past with devices with working software that worked great. It was elegant, but totally undocumented, which FDA doesn't like anymore. So we've had to go back and reverse engineer or almost rewrite software because they stuck with someone too long who didn't have systems and QMS sophistication. That's one. I think the other one is picking the wrong bucket and trying to shoehorn someone into a project who really isn't a great fit for what they're trying to accomplish.
Sure, thanks. Okay, seeing no other questions from the audience, we'll bring up Ken Levitt from Dorsey.
So this next segment will talk about the various types of intellectual property that are relevant when you're working with a design contractor to help design and develop your medical device, and we'll walk through certain characteristics of each type of IP that are relevant to that type. Ultimately, all these questions feed into two main IP strategy categories. The first one is, can you sell your device, or do you have freedom to operate? And the second one is, can you keep others from selling the device, or can you at least keep them from selling a device that has features that are competitive with your key features, the one that you've really invested in? The first category is pretty straightforward. The IP that the customer brings to the design table, the customer retains. The design company has a limited license to use that IP during the design process, so that they're not infringing during the design process itself. The next category of IP is the background IP that's brought to the process by the contract design company. And this might consist of basic building blocks and know-how, the tools that Jim was talking about. And these types of IP tools are part of the deliverables that are delivered to the customer at the end of the process. To the extent that the contract design company has existing patent technology and the customer wants access to that, the parties will agree to an appropriate license. There are several considerations that are listed up here. The three most important ones are probably the first three: geographic scope, whether there's field restrictions, and then exclusivity. There's also new IP that's developed during the design process, and patentable technology is typically assigned to the customer. To the extent that non-patentable technology is developed, the contract design company will be free to use that type of technology in its business going forward. So those types of technology are more straightforward. You have more control over them. The one where you have less control is third-party IP. So a patent gives you the right to exclude others from practicing what you've patented. It doesn't give you the right to practice that technology yourself. And so people handle that by doing freedom to operate analysis or clearance work. The phrases freedom to operate and clearance, they're a bit of a misnomer because it's not a binary situation where you're free to operate or you're not, you infringe or you don't. You don't really know if there's infringement until the jury has decided if there's infringement after litigation. And so what it really is, instead, it runs the spectrum. It's a litigation type of analysis where you assess the risks of being sued on a particular patent and the risks of being found to infringe if there is litigation. So who does the FTO analysis? Well, during the design process, the customer is involved intimately in all stages of the design process. The customer is making the decisions as to which features to include, how to include them, and whether to include them. And the customer also brings to the table unique and specialized expertise in that particular product category. And so because the decision process for FTO involves a series of decisions that each one assesses risk and what the risk tolerance is, it's part of the more broad IP strategy and business strategies that the customer wants to be able to retain control over. So during the FTO process, most patents that you look at, you can have a pretty high degree of confidence that the risk of being found to infringe is probably pretty low. There's going to be a smaller number of patents that require a more careful look, maybe some small changes to your design, maybe a more exhaustive look at the file history or the claims of the patent, so that you can be comfortable that the level of risk that's associated with that patent is low enough that you're willing to accept it. But then there's going to be a small number of what we call problem patents. And this is particularly the case if you're trying to design and develop a product that you know is going to compete with a competitor's already patented product. So there are certain considerations that you can work through to try to figure out how to handle the more problem patents. The first one is figure out what the patent really relates to. If it covers a nice-to-have selling feature in the product that you're designing, maybe you can change that sufficiently to move away from that patent. Or maybe you can drop that particular feature and sell the competitive product. If the patent that we're talking about covers an essential feature or a core concept to your product, then a more thorough review of the file history will be required to find out if there are theories for non-infringement that you're comfortable with, so the risk is sufficiently low that you can move forward despite that patent. So we often talk about FTO analysis in the context of non-infringement. But what about invalidity? Well, some people like to look at invalidity instead of non-infringement because once you've come to a conclusion as to invalidity, then you don't need to worry about that patent going forward for either design changes or for new products. I think, though, that when you talk about invalidity in the FTO context, there's a number of reasons why it's more difficult to prove invalidity at trial as opposed to non-infringement. And so the better practice is not to move forward with invalidity as the basis for FTO unless you've got a strong argument for anticipation that the patented issue is clearly invalid. And that's because proving even the strongest obviousness case at trial is far from a sure bet in front of a jury. And in fact, if you're going before a jury and you have, implausible or pretty weak non-infringement arguments, then even if you have a strong obviousness case, the jury is less likely to take it seriously and give it any credit. Another option is to acquire the patent that's causing you problems or to acquire the patent owner or take a license to it. Expiration is an option, at least legally, although from a business standpoint, it's not always practical to wait for expiration. It depends on the remaining term and how important things are. And finally, if you choose to proceed, then you get into the weighing of the risks that are talked about on the right-hand side, the risk of suit and the strength of defenses, all viewed through the lens of how important is this feature to your product. And what you can do is you can obtain a written opinion of counsel so that if you are sued and if you do lose, you'll pay damages, but the damages shouldn't be troubled and you shouldn't have to pay attorney's fees. So the FTO process itself is a very iterative one. You want to start off at the very beginning of the design process and really get your arms around what patents are out there. And then from a timing perspective, you'll do a number of additional, much more limited searches and analyses as you move forward, as you add key design features, as you come up with new important features and functionality, and also at certain important milestones of the product's life, such as when you have a design freeze or before launch. You'll want to update your searching to see if there are newly issued patents, if there are newly published applications, to see if anything has changed. And then finally, when it comes to the FTO process, you always want to assume there's going to be litigation over your choices with regard to the designs. And so you don't necessarily have to change how your business operates, but you do want to change how your business documents things. So your people on your design team, they're presumably working with counsel, and so they should keep all of their documents on the FTO work in a separate folder, whether it's electronic or physical, mark that folder legal, and then also mark all the documents themselves, whether electronic or paper, attorney-client privileged. And that way, if there's litigation 10 years down the road, whoever is reviewing those documents to decide whether they should be disclosed to the other side will know not to produce them. You also, at the same time, want to assume that all this stuff's going to see the light of day at some point. And that most commonly happens where there's litigation, you're accused of willful infringement, and to protect yourself against the willful infringement charge, you decide to produce your written opinion of counsel. That production of the opinion is a waiver of the attorney-client privilege, and so the related communications also are available to the other side so they can challenge the opinion and the extent to which you actually relied on it. And so you want to manage the communications and the documentation during the process, and that goes beyond the obvious of never writing down something that you're going to struggle to explain later if it sees the light of day. Also, seemingly innocuous comments, such as a design person writing down why a certain patent is not a problem, that's not always helpful because later during litigation, if trial counsel has a different strategy for why a patent is not infringed, and that strategy is in conflict with something that was recorded during the design process, it undermines the value of the opinion itself and the extent to which you could rely on it. The last category of IP is publicly available IP. This could be journal articles, expired patents. You're not going to have FTO issues. You're also not going to have exclusivity, obviously. But a word on open source software. Open source software is thought of something that's readily available, but many of these open source software packages have their own license terms. Commonly, they're very benign, but not always. For example, in the case of a GPL, the general public license, that type of license is called a viral license that is considered to infect your entire source code, which removes the copyright protections from that source code. And finally, a brief word on the strategies for patent prosecution. There are clear connections between the FTO analysis and your patent prosecution strategies. You're typically looking at the same key features, the same key functionality when you're deciding what you want to try to obtain exclusive rights to, and there's an overlap between that and the FTO analysis that you've done.
Ken, you talked a lot about updating the FTO search sort of along the development cycle and reanalyzing risks, et cetera. How does one know when the patent search is sufficient and complete?
So there's not a clear answer to that question, unfortunately, because there's so many patents and patent applications out there that different search strategies will turn up different pieces of prior art. And this is common in litigation, for example, where the amount of effort you put into the prior art search will turn up different types of prior art, and different strategies will turn up different results. And so the way you do this is when you are doing your searching, you're looking at prolific inventors in a field, you're looking at known competitors in a field, and you're also looking at certain technology. And the more searching you do, when you start to see the same results over and over, then you can have some degree of confidence that the results that you're finding are generally thorough and complete.
Thank you. Now we'll bring up Steve Schmidt, CEO of Resolution Medical.
Welcome and thank you, Derek, and thank you to Minitronics for inviting me to the panel. When Jim emailed me on doing virtual development, I was very excited since it probably makes up about 80% of what our company does are companies that have no employees all the way to 3 employees, and they're looking for that development house / manufacturing house that can get them all the way through clinical trials. So I took a little different approach on this presentation. I went back to our last 3 virtual development houses that were successful on getting through clinicals or getting into the market. And I sat with them and just talked through, if we were going to talk to a panel like this, what would be the 5 or 6 key takeaways that we would want you to look for going into it, or what's important on having the success rate of getting it in the market or getting into clinicals. And the first was really trust in the relationships. We talked about the team earlier. They all emphasize that as number 1 on their list because along the process, old school was you created a company, you hired all the engineers, you put in all the functions, you kept everything internal, you didn't share out. Virtual development, you are a true extension of that company. You have to relinquish some control of your product and processes along the way. And all 3 thought that was the most difficult thing to let go. To how do you trust and make sure that the contract developer will fill those gaps that they can't fill or they don't want to hire for. And also, they're trying not to put up bricks and mortar and a lot of integrated systems and a lot of other things. They're trying to use you for that. So they also have to fit into your system. So it's a two-way street on both sides. Mentioned earlier too, access and location to capital, both financial and human. A lot of time virtual companies get some money from family and friends or get a little bit of money to get a design or have N=1 in a prototype lab that works or get some IP and they want to take it to the next level. So there's a lot of risk sharing in how we're going to raise money. Where are you located? Are you US, OUS, time zones, languages? Just because you are an extension of that company, if you can think about, your own boss being in Europe, you still have to have that effective communication in education and what you need to be successful. So capital becomes really, really important. Also on the capital side, typically they're out raising funding, so they're asking us, can you help us budget, quote, figure out what we need to get to our clinical trial. We want to make sure there's enough funding available for that. But a lot of times that comes with milestones and other things. So it's kind of a risk-taking between both parties because typically we're hiring or utilizing an engineering team on a long-term development type program. And then having the experts. I mentioned this earlier, but to Jim's different types of lettuce, that is exactly true. You need to make sure that you have an experts and you know that you can execute in your lane. And that's where we partner a lot. If someone comes to us for something electromechanical that is not our lane, that's where we'll go to Minitronics and partner with them, where we know where we want to be and where we can execute on. And that really needs to be established up front, so you don't end up just accepting any job. It's not just, it's also the contract developer's job to say, you know, this really is not our lane either. We can't be someone to everybody. We want to make sure that we're in the zone where we have technical skill sets. And it's very crucial for that. So, you know, that was the first kind of key takeaway from our virtual development partners. The second is the business model and risk management. I put open book costing there, but it's like, imagine if you did have your own company and it was your own product line. You still need to put together a budget. You know, you need money for materials, tooling, you need an engineering team. You still need to go down that journey. And the virtual company needs to know that during the development cycle if you are going to be an extension of their company. So transparency is key to doing that. Having that open book model, having estimates. Yeah, we write over a little bit, we write under a little bit, but there has to be something put together for people to plan and raise enough money and also have execution of what we're doing. IP ownership, talked about a little bit there, but there's also the know-how. If there's any one risk area that they pointed out during this interviewing process was some of them were like, I don't want to necessarily teach you on how to do the special sauce and you can apply that to other product lines. It kind of gets to be a slippery slope there when you're doing that. So sometimes it's in the beneficial of the virtual company to keep that special sauce and maybe not share it if they don't feel comfortable in sharing information. We do assign all IP over during the development cycle, so that typically is not a problem. It's really on probably the know-how side of the stuff that you don't submit. And then managing exit strategy. This is an interesting one. Most virtual development companies, you know, they usually have an exit strategy after clinicals. They get some good results and they want to sell their company off. You know, what does that mean for both parties? Some of them want to transfer products to low labor countries. How do we help you do that and how do we help you execute that? Some of them might want you to, we've had conversations of helping us vertically integrate after we get to the market. They just don't want to put up bricks and mortar until they get good clinical results. So talking about that up front so you know where that product's going and through manufacturing so there's no surprises at the end is critical for those guys too. Flexible quality system. This is an interesting one and a lot of people use flexible quality systems as a kind of a generic term, but your system really does have to be flexible with the customer's quality system and the regulatory submission. If you think of the virtual customer submitting for the regulatory bodies, they're going to see one submission. So whether you write 70% of those documents and they write 30 or vice versa, they all need to be flawless on that submission, align, and look like one company did that. And if you can think about a service provider and having multiple companies with multiple different quality systems, it needs to be flexible at all levels to do that. That's been the key on getting at least approvals, both through the FDA and EU in other areas. Core competency of the developer. Really know who you're an expert in. And I kind of put down engineering solution versus contract manufacturing. If you need help developing your requirements and you go to a contract manufacturer and the first question out of their mouth is, what are your requirements and I'll build it, that should be a red flag that you probably need to be with somebody else who's going to help you develop those requirements, help you develop what you need, do the benchtop testing, do your DV testing in those core competency areas that align with your engineering expertise. Don't take on electromechanical if you're a catheter house and you know catheters really well, or if you know neural needs really well. Don't go take it on other product lines that are far from that. And we touched on a little bit on the network and partnership. Jim pointed this out, we can't be experts at everything. So know what you need to outsource. Help your virtual developer manage that. So for example, go manage the sterilization house, the biocompatibility, the shake, rattle, and roll, aging, packaging. You don't need to be an expert. There's a lot of people all within a 6-mile radius of you, if you live in Minneapolis, that you can drive your car to and do this every day for all the OEMs. It speeds it up. You can manage it for your customer, then they don't have to become an expert in it either. But, outsource the stuff that you can to work on speed and get them to market because they're always obviously burning cash. The last slide I have is, I asked the question of within the engineering team inside of Resolution Medical, who would be your perfect outsourcing partner? And really, it was the relationships and the experts of the team that popped out of that. There's a lot of speed, culture, flexibility, responsiveness, customer focus, of course. Those are all good things that they said, this is why I would go with a company like ours. But at the end of the day, it was really having that high-level team in place. And then, what I like to say is controlled growth, right? Don't take on too much where you can't execute what you have on your plate. A lot of these developments with the virtual companies are longer term, year-long, putting together a team. You might be utilizing some cross functions like quality, design, purchasing, stuff like that. But have your core competency engineers that want to stay with that for the duration of their team. And like I said, typically it's a longer term process.
All right, thank you, Steve. Questions for Steve? All right. Seeing none, Steve, you talked a little bit about the special sauce that your clients bring. It seems like there's probably a fine line between your customers wanting to keep that core knowledge in-house, but also relying on you for expertise. How do you manage the practical knowledge of your customer's product with what they're hoping to keep very tightly guarded?
Yeah, good question. It does become difficult. There is a fine line there to be able to manage their special sauce with everybody else's and bring in your expertise to the table. We do it one of two ways. Either our customers will keep it to themselves and share very little on what's required. The second way is we typically set up their own areas for development. Again, being an extension of that company, we'll have those 1 or 2 engineers that are experts in what we want them to do. And we'll literally have, this is their area, and keep it there. And then we share across services like quality and others. That seems to help out a lot. And then there are some customers that just don't want to share information. Back to that first bullet point on trust in that relationship. And that typically doesn't go very well. And those are some of the times that you might, even on our side, want to say, this might not be the right project for us.
Sure.
Can I chime in that as well?
Please.
So one thing I think is very important is when you're doing your initial contracts, just be very thoughtful about how you organize the IP parts of your development and manufacturing contracts. Like Ken mentioned, these various buckets. The more clear those buckets are in the contract, the better it is for everybody. Being super clear on what your background IP is, being very clear what's patented, being very clear that if there are patentable deliverables, you end up owning those pieces outright. Being clear what you're going to have to license from that vendor, from third parties and so on. Because vendors accumulate know-how over time. If they understand that part of what they're doing is protected by you and it's part of your secret sauce, they can steer away from that. If they don't understand that, they may blunder and overlap with what you'd consider to be trade secrets. So clarity is super important there.
Good. Ken, anything to add on there? Well, before I change the topic, great. Another thing that sort of came up a lot in the panel here, and this is a question to the panel, was finding the right fit and when there's not a great fit between what the client's potentially asking for and what your services are, how do you know that? How do you assess that? And then where do you how do you try to help them if you know they're not a fit for you? Where do you send them, and how does that process typically work? That's to the panel. Go ahead, Jim. That's to Jim, then the panel.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think typically if both parties are asking questions early on, it's immensely helpful. So the worst thing is to be into a project 5 months and the customer says, well, of course you should be doing X. And the vendor says, you never told me to do X. That's a colossal failure on both parties and is never going to end up in a happy place. You said that vendors know how to help figure requirements out. Yeah. You may come to a vendor with requirements that are, in your mind, super clear, but there are levels of questions underneath that your vendor needs to ask, and you have to be able to answer as you work through it together to sort out what really is and isn't in scope. It may be because you know the market and the user experience, everything else. Well, of course, the software has to do blah, blah. But if your vendor doesn't know that, they're not going to do it. It's not their fault, but they're going to disappoint you later on. So communication, especially early on, framing the project, framing the scope, being uber clear, getting clear on deliverables, and how user requirements become product requirements, which become design requirements, which become design, DBT specs, all the way to the very, very, very end. That linkage is utterly critical. And if you're unclear at the beginning, it will almost always cost time, money, and aggravation, and heartache later on.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we, typically in the beginning stages of talking to whether it's a doctor or somebody who's come up with a great idea or has some intellectual property, you get a sense after about an hour talking with them whether their depth of knowledge on how to get the product to clinicals or to market. And that kind of always gauges us on how much energy we think we're going to have to put into that program and our estimates. And then what we do to help over-communicate that, I would say, is we have our standard 4-phase PDP process like everybody else does. Even though that we help develop requirements, we actually go down every line item with an X on either side on who owns it. Even though that there might be shared help in developing that requirement, there has to be a clear owner of that document. To Jim's point, like if they own user requirements and we own DFMEA, we have to do that together as partners. But somebody has to own putting pen to paper, getting the document managed, getting it through the system. So we do that right up front in our quoting process so everybody knows who kind of owns what, and then we'll help them develop that.
Sure.
Sorry, one more bit. I mean, you probably do the same thing. We deal with a wide range of sophistication levels. We have people who are very systematic about product development and have great backgrounds there. Other startups just have less of that. So there are some times when our very first really kickoff meeting ends up being an educational process around how the whole linkages work between user requirements all the way to shippable product. So again, we all have different backgrounds. If your background really isn't deep in development systems, that's fine. But it's going to be realistic, and just make sure you talk to a vendor or get consulting help or whatever else for those people to help you get clear on requirements. Because again, the clearer you are early on, the less money and time you're going to spend getting to your destination.
Great. I had another question for Ken. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of inside counsel versus outside counsel in determining when to raise infringement risks with your customer's management team.
So I think with regard to that question, I think inside counsel has the harder job. When outside counsel is working with the design team, you're working with them hand in hand through all stages of it, and you have people that you're communicating with. So as you are sorting through the patents and figuring out which ones require more in-depth analysis, you're doing that in connection with people at the company, and oftentimes they're helping you and they're even taking the lead to do much of the initial legwork to help narrow down the issues that really require more focus. And so you have somebody on the inside that is fully familiar with all the issues, and you can work through that person to help them identify the real risks, and they'll know when to go to management. When it comes to inside counsel, they kind of have a harder job of it because some of these decisions they make themselves. So when they're doing this analysis with outside counsel, they're essentially a filter for their own management. And so many of the inside lawyers, they'll have their own IP strategies and business guides as to how they follow it. But commonly, on the issues where there's lesser levels of risk, they'll just sign off on those by themselves. And it's only the cases where there's higher levels of risk that get brought to management's attention. You know, it's worth noting when it comes to the risk, we mentioned how it's a kind of a patent by patent analysis as you work through the FTO. And some companies are very conservative and they say, we won't go to market unless there's a very clear reason why there's no infringement. Other companies are much more aggressive and they'll say, as long as we have a plausible non-infringement position so that we can avoid willfulness at trial, we'll take the risk on damages. We just want to avoid willfulness and paying attorney's fees. And it's the inside counsel that knows what those tolerances are and knows when to bring those questions to management's attention.
Can I chime in a bit more on that too?
Please.
I'd say one more thing to think about is be careful to not consider that your vendor is going to be your sort of de facto counsel around IP stuff. So even if your vendor is very, very capable, they typically work on a lot of different products, a lot of different markets. They're not going to be very, very deep. So you're going to need to be aware of how your design's progressing, where it's going. If it's wandering into spaces that you think are problematic from an IP perspective, you need to let the vendor know that, because they will not know, even if they're sophisticated. You know, they're not going to charge you $400 grand for a freedom to operate opinion. And if they did, you couldn't indemnify against it anyway. So I just wouldn't put too much faith in the fact that your vendor is going to prompt you that there are IP problems in your design. They're not going to know your space. They won't know your user case. They won't know the patent landscape around your device. So, and that's going to have to fall on the OEM, because the vendors, they just don't know it. And if they did, they couldn't afford to help you that much with it anyway.
So a common theme that's come up sort of throughout the panel here is the idea that you're sort of an extension of your customer's company, particularly in a virtual environment. As a bottom-feeding sales guy, I know we always say we're going to be an extension of your company, but it seems more sort of true in this case. Maybe you could talk a little bit about another term I heard a lot was shared risk. And talk about how you're sharing risks with clients and really make the case for being that extension of their business. That's to the panel. Start with you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think my initial point on sharing information and having that relationship and trust and being that extension, you know, as you go through developments, whether they're estimates or actually doing the development testing on their product, there's always risk in passing or failing, and there's risk to budgets, there's risk to patients. There's a lot of risks that are tried to be managed. When it comes to the side of the patient, typically the virtual company kind of has an expert in that hand, and as it goes to product, design for manufacturability and all those other things, that starts to transfer to the engineering service provider in our world. So, but we do it jointly. You know, we review all risk documents as whether it's in the virtual company's hands or ours. So we, you know, have procedures in place on sampling sizes and risk profiles and things like that that we follow, and we also get agreement with our customers that what we're doing mitigates that risk or reduces it. So it's a real shared process when we're doing that. And you know, there's always a risk to the business model too, right? I mean, our business model typically is passing through materials and tooling. If we estimate wrong or there's changes down the road that hinder timelines, and you know, it's communicated, but it's also a shared risk to both our customer and Resolution Medical. So.
Yeah, I think I would say that it's just very important to retain situational awareness and control. If you're doing, you know, design FMEAs and process FMEAs and so on, if you have a more sophisticated vendor that can typically help with that, you'll typically need them to help. If they're going very deep technically, you'll need to help connect those dots. But I think it's not a function you can really entirely delegate to a vendor without excessive risk. You have to control what's going on, and it's your device. you're going to put it in real human beings, and you need to make sure you've got confidence in your design and the process that it's built with. So the risk is always there. You can allocate some between the vendor and the OEM back and forth, but in the end, if you want to be assured of success down the road, you're going to want to make sure you've got good control over the risk of your device.
And I think that's it on the panel side. Other audience questions? Open it up to the floor.
Hi.
You're next, sir. I'm sorry.
Hi, Jesse. Interested to hear your feedback on when you're dealing with these small virtual companies that typically don't have a quality management system in place. How do you manage them if they don't have an understanding of what's required? Or how do you manage your internal quality management system as they're working through developing theirs in parallel with your product development?
Yeah, I'll start on that. I don't think any of our virtual companies had a quality system when they started. So great question. We typically will outsource. A company has an off-the-shelf system that has the main requirements that you need to have post-market and a lot of the other things in supplier control. You have to customize it to your business, but there is help there to do that. And then secondly, what we do is we will also, with our customers, we can copy and paste our quality system to give them a starting point to modify it to theirs. We mirror it in our system. So both ways you can do it. But there are people out there that can help you get a quality system up and running electronically that is compliant to what you need for your 1345 and whatever you're trying to do.
And we skin the cat a little bit different. So we have a QMS system that we basically let our vendors use it, so customers use it. So typically a customer will, some of the virtual ones will just have a vendor management SOP that points to our design history, design control system. So when the audit trail comes down through them, it goes right to our system. We get audited by FDA or ISO, whatever else. We can do it all online. We've got a portal, so it's pretty easy. We do lots of PMA products. We've had 7 clean audits in a row. So we just let them use it. It's 24/7 access. The customers can just use it live. The documents always live there. They can get copies of everything, but basically just leverage our system. They don't have to build their own. And that's worked out pretty well for the most part. I'd say out of the startups we work with, I'd say probably 90% use that system, probably 10% choose to use their own QMS, design history files, design control systems.
So just to add on to that, we also use a system called Grand Avenue that our customers also have a portal into. Same thing where you can sign off on ECOs, sign off on any document that pertains to your procedure, your design history file. All that's pretty standard, I would say, within the engineering service provider house. So you'll see every part of your history file and all your records and everything. And we have you actually sign, since you own the design, you are a signatory on the ECO electronically.
Yeah, just because you're using somebody else's system, you can still have control over all the ECOs, so it's people aren't going off it, on their own tangent.
We have time for one more, sir.
Yeah. Ken Michike with the QT company. We're actually a software firm. Ken, you had a bullet about beware open source software, so I didn't know if you could maybe highlight some of those pitfalls. And then from a legal perspective, what might guide recommendations for your clients as far as commercial, if there's any case law, or what inputs might you have for the audience?
It's not really easy, unfortunately, especially where you're hiring people to write code for you. Sometimes there's cost constraints, and it's easy for folks to grab existing pieces of open source software from libraries. So I think having your own QC, having your own, checking the software, running it through your own programs to make sure there's no open source in there, having clear expectations in the agreement for your people that are coding that as to where they can and can't get software from, that's helpful. So those are the approaches I think you can take there.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panel: Jim Reed, Ken Levitt, and Steve Schmidt. And thank you. You've been a great audience. We appreciate your time and attention today. And Brian told me we're dismissing folks to a networking break, so come up and say hello.